Adam, we are going to talk about Napoleon in Poland today. And what is kind of your general overview of Napoleon's involvement in the great country of Poland?
It's difficult to put it in one, to encapsulate it, because he kept changing his mind about things. And indeed, Napoleon's greatest fault, and the thing that really led to his downfall, made it impossible for the other powers in Europe to finally just accept him and get on with him, was that he kept changing his mind and changing his plans, and he would never, and finally they just all decided, listen, this guy is impossible to live with. So Poland was very much in the minds of people of Napoleon's generation in the latter part of the 18th century, because it, on one hand, it was extolled by people like Rousseau and other philosophers as potentially one of the great democracies. Then it enacted in 1791 this very progressive constitution, which was hailed all over the world as being the blueprint for a modern state, and so on. So most people, most progressives, were in sympathy with Poland and appalled at the partitions when Russia, Prussia, and Austria simply, in the most cynical way, just gobbled it up and closed down the country. The trouble was that later on, in 1806, a French, really a journalist called Rullière, published he called it Histoire des Révolutions de Pologne, which was supposed to be a history of Poland, in which he took a very negative view and a very French kind of attitude that anything outside France was basically rubbish. And he wrote a lot of rubbish about Russia and Catherine the Great, and repeated all sorts of nonsense. But he published in France this first, as it were, modern history of Poland, and that it made out that the Poles had been partitioned because they were hopeless at running their country. So it was contrary to Rousseau's view. So that definitely lay at the back of the mind of many Frenchmen of his generation who'd read that, who thought the Poles were terrific, brave, good chaps and all the rest of it, but really not quite serious enough to run a country. His first experience or contact with Poles, of course, was in 1797 in Italy, because there'd been a lot of Polish military personnel who had to go into exile, and they tended to go to France, or some went to America, but they tended to go to France or to Italy. And then they found that as he was fighting the Austrian armies, he was taking lots of prisoners and indeed getting deserters of Poles who'd been pressed into the Austrian armies from the part of Poland that Austria had taken. So the French Republic then decided in January 1797 to create a Polish armed unit in Italy, and this grew. At first, it was designated as as being the army of the newly founded state of Lombardy, then of the Cisalpine Republic, and it kept changing its name. But it fought under Napoleon, and then in subsequent campaigns in Italy, right through. Some of the regiments were still fighting in Italy in 1807, 1808. Another one, Polish unit, was formed in Germany, which fought alongside French troops, not under Napoleon, and that was known as the Polish Legion of the Danube. But when the Peace of Lunéville was signed in 1801, these Poles became inconvenient, because the whole point of them was that they were going to fight the Austrians.
Right.
And so he sent them all to fight in Saint-Domingue, i.e. Haiti,
Right.
where thousands died of yellow fever.
Yeah.
A number defected to the side of the black insurgents, feeling that actually, why are we the victims of imperialism? It's a fight for the imperialists.
Right.
Indeed, there are descendants in Haiti today with Polish names, descended from those. And that, so very few of the Poles that he'd sent out survived, and some of those who did survive only survived because they'd been taken prisoner by the British, and in some cases pressed into British regiments serving in the West Indies. So in Poland, after the first flush of excitement about Napoleon in 1797, 1798, when the marching song was composed, which is now Poland's national anthem, in
Right.
which Bonaparte is mentioned, that rather died away. But still, and Napoleon at that stage had no more interest in Poland at all. After Jena, he found himself in Berlin, and there's a strange, in a letter he writes, he talks of new horizons opening. He suddenly realized that he'd not only managed to trash the Austrians, he had completely trashed what was supposed to be the greatest army in Europe, the Prussian army.
Right.
And the entire Prussian state had disintegrated. Entire army corps and defensive fortresses were surrendering to French companies or squadrons.
Yeah.
And so he began to think of wider horizons. And a delegation of Poles from the Prussian partition of Poland turned up and said, well, can we now at least be free of the Prussians?
Right.
He then thought, well, maybe this could all be very useful. So he tried to get the Polish hero of the 1794 insurrection, Tadeusz Kościuszko, who had fought in the American War of Independence and was living in Paris. He tried to get him along. Kościuszko refused, calling him an imperialist. But he got various other Poles, all the Poles he could find, and decided to go along with it, because Murat had gone on to Poznan and thence to Warsaw as an advance guard, pursuing the retreat, fending off the Russians.
Right.
And he was received ecstatically as a liberator. And he wrote to Napoleon saying, the enthusiasm of these people is extraordinary. And when Napoleon appeared in Poznan, the young men of the gentry just got on their horses and volunteered to become a sort of honor guard for him. And very promptly he did turn them into the famous first light horseman, the chevaux légers of the guard. So he began to think of Poland as an opportunity.
Yeah.
He had absolutely no fixed idea. And here it was really after Friedland, after he'd finally defeated the Russians, against the advice of Talleyrand, he got excited by the idea of an alliance with Russia for a number of really quite emotional reasons. One was that he thought that with Russia he could go and beat the Brits in India. That was one consideration. The other one was that Alexander was a young, insecure young man, a bit like himself, and he thought he would have I think the fact also that, Alexander may have been the Tsar, but they were a very new dynasty, and they were not really considered very respectable. And I think that Napoleon felt, although he'd beaten them, he still felt slightly embarrassed with regard to the Holy Roman Emperor or the Emperor of Austria, as he then became,
right,
or kings from old established dynasties. And Alexander was a bit of a parvenu because the Romanovs were very new, and anyway, they were considered by a lot of Europe as being pretty backward. And he had a sort of distaste for Austria, which was unfortunate because Talleyrand said, look, at this point, you've managed to beat all three of the major powers. France's security depends on controlling the main landmass of Germany. And the best thing to do is to turn Austria into a permanent strategic ally who has exactly the same interests, because the Austrians don't want the Prussians and they don't want the Russians having influence. And that was Talleyrand's advice. And Talleyrand had even been in communication secretly, unofficially, with the Austrians, who said they were prepared to give up their part of Poland, and Prussia's part of Poland was by now occupied by the French, and the Russians had been beaten hollow. So there was an opportunity, and this is what Talleyrand suggested, to recreate Poland, and with a wipe out Prussia altogether, really, and with a friendly Poland and a friendly Austria, France's eastern flank was guaranteed, and it could be the dominant power in Central Europe without any fears. He even, I think it was Talleyrand, but several people noted that because the Polish cause was so popular in places like Britain, he suggested that even the Brits might accept such a solution, or it could be sold to them, because public opinion in Britain would. But Napoleon didn't. He decided to turn Russia into his principal ally, which was a fundamental mistake.
Yeah.
And because they had no common interests at all. But at the same time, being Napoleon, he decided to just keep a little, a whip hand over Russia by creating the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, fundamentally out of the Prussian part of Poland that he captured, which of course was an absolute, it was a nightmare for the Russians, because they thought, this would be the jumping off point for the gradual reconquest of the Polish parts of the Russian Empire, which, after all, they'd only been annexed quite recently.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit, because some of my American or British or just any of my worldwide listeners may not be familiar with the partitions of Poland and King Stanislaus, who was kind of the leader at the time. Can you talk to that point? Like, what happened there? Because I know the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one of the biggest and most prosperous countries in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. And then I think over gradual decline of economics and lack of a navy, few fortresses, it got partitioned by its neighbors, as you mentioned, Prussia, Russia, and Austria. What happened to the Commonwealth?
Fundamentally, it was huge, as you say, and it was not at all centralized. It was a very devolved state. It was very regionally organized. It was a democracy. The executive, both the king was elected. The parliament had an elected parliament. It had local elected bodies, and the judges were elected. It had an almost symbolic standing army, on the basis that Democrats don't like standing armies because they're expensive and they can be used by the king to impose taxes and legislation and so on. So it was just too democratic and therefore disorganized for its own good. And it was surrounded by 3 states which were both turning, well, all 3, but certainly Prussia was entirely centralized and despotic. So was Russia. And under Joseph II, Austria was becoming more and more centralized. And so they, and all 3 were terrified that one of the others or 2 of the others would take over Poland. And it became almost a necessity for them to somehow to deal with this problem. Also, what they didn't like was the freedom, because Catherine the Great of Russia was furious because serfs from Russia would just hightail it into Poland, where they were free men or women, and peasants in Prussia who didn't want to be drafted into the army could go to Poland and find a job on somebody's estate. So it invited into foreign intervention, as weak states do, particularly because there was this tripartite standoff between the three neighbours, and it did begin to organise itself in the 1780s, and then passed this constitution, which would have turned it into a very efficient state. And at that stage, the three neighbours decided it has to be closed down pronto, because particularly with the French Revolution going on the other side. So the idea that it would be a hotbed of Jacobinism was... Napoleon had left this, he created this Grand Duchy of Warsaw, but partly for his own purposes and to allay Russian fears of it. He promptly sent most of its troops off to fight in Spain. And these
people they performed well,
volunteered to go and fight for Poland, and they were hunted off to Spain, and were in most cases furious at being, again, fighting against. They didn't mind fighting against the Brits, but they were very upset at having to fight against Spaniards who were fighting for their own freedom. So,
right.
And also what he did was that it's typical of Napoleon. First of all, he took out a huge loan based on Poland, so, as security.
Right.
He also gave estates all over Poland, which should have belonged to the government, to his generals. And so he also impoverished the country, as well as taking away, the young men and sending them off to Spain, where an awful lot of them died.
Right.
And the Poles, when he turned up, were very divided, because most sensible and older people were very skeptical about the whole thing. And they remembered what he'd done to the legions and sending them to Haiti. Conservative elements were not happy at the idea of the Code Napoleon coming in, because of course what he did was to bring in French government, emancipate all peasants who were tied to the land in any way, and so on. And that was very unpopular in many areas.
Yeah. Let's talk, if we can, about Maria Walewska, who's probably the most famous mistress to Napoleon while he was in Poland. What influence, if any, did she have on Napoleon in making Poland or the Grand Duchy into an independent state?
I'm not sure that she had a great influence. Possibly slightly. I think he had to do something, and he did absolutely fall for her, because although he loved Josephine, who was very important to him, he had a bit of an inferiority complex, because she was more sophisticated. He thought of her as an aristocrat. She wasn't much of an aristocrat, but anyway, she played the part of one, and he was, and she knew how to sort of cut him down to size. And when he met Maria Walewska, who was just a lovely little sweet girl, he was delighted, because you see, she'd been married off to a much, much older man, who almost certainly never consummated the marriage. And while Josephine made him feel small, not just in stature, but down there, so to speak, this girl had no comparison because she hadn't knocked around.
Yeah.
And so she was just thought he was the best thing since sliced bread because, you know, he was sweet to her and
Right.
and did the right things.
And they had a
so
child together, correct?
He had adored, and they spent. He had a real cohabitation with her that winter before the Friedland campaign,
Right.
and before Tilsit, and I'm sure that she gave him a, let's say, a rosier view of the Poles than he'd had before. Although his view of the Poles had improved when he saw the troops. So she did have, she probably did have some kind of an effect. And certainly she was very much pushed into his arms by a number of patriots, hoping that this would that he would have that effect. And he kept a very soft spot for her for the rest of his life, and was very generous with her. And he brought her over in 1809. He brought her over to Vienna while he was after Wagram. He then even brought her over to Elba briefly.
Yeah, they had a child together, I believe.
It was there was more to it than just sex, but his relationship with the Poles in Poland remained entirely opportunistic. And when he realized that, for instance, after Wagram, when the army of the Duchy of Warsaw pushed the Austrians out of almost the entire part of Poland, which they had taken in the partitions, and they were hoping to add that to the Grand Duchy. And he didn't. He let them keep about half of it and gave the rest to Russia, of all people, hoping that this would be a sweetener for the Russians. It did absolutely nothing.
Right.
People don't understand, as we see on a daily basis, that the Russians are totally impervious to any gesture of goodwill. They only see it's always the glass half empty as far as they're concerned.
Right.
And they were just alarmed that the Poles had been allowed to keep half of the bit that they liberated from Austria. But then, of course, along comes the problem with Russia, and he collects this huge army with which in 1811, 1812, he didn't really have a plan of what he wanted to do. What he would have liked would have been to frighten, intimidate Alexander into coming back into his embrace.
Right.
And he didn't want to invade Russia, that's absolutely clear. But he thought having all those, well, he needed to have a big army, so he brought troops from everywhere. And he thought psychologically the Russians would be intimidated by the more troops from different countries. That's why he had Portuguese and even Spanish and Italian and Croatian and I mean troops from Italians, Poles, everybody, Belgians, Dutch, and of course all the Germans. That this would help intimidate Russians, and of course the Poles were the largest non-French contingent because they were nearly 1,000.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's talk about that. The Prince Poniatowski, who is probably the most famous officer from Poland in Napoleon's army, he worked with Marshal Davout to build the Polish army back up. He was the nephew of King Stanislaus. How did Prince Poniatowski work with Napoleon in the invasion of Russia?
He was an absolutely lovely, charming man. He was good looking. He had immense charm. He was a great womanizer. And he had a sort of swashbuckling manner that I haven't got the quote here, but I dug it out for Andrew Roberts for his book on French marshals. But it runs something like this, with his hat cocked to one side, a saber in his hand, mounting a horse beautifully. If he turned around at the edge of the precipice into hell and said, "Come on, chaps, let's go," the entire army would have followed him because he had that kind of a following. He was a good soldier. He was probably not a great overall commander, but he distinguished himself in 1792. He then fought well. But of course, again, going into Russia, Napoleon did the completely mad thing of sending the troops that were to be most loyal to him into the most terrible, murderous battles, and he kept the two untrustworthy allies, the Prussians and the Austrians, on the sideline where they were hardly bled at all.
Right.
And he used the Poles in a frontal attack on the fortress of Smolensk, where they lost thousands of people, and at the same time he kept sort of insulting Poniatowski. At one stage he says, "You're all cowards and you're no good," and he was very silly about it, and I suppose what he was, it's difficult to tell what his psychological motives were, but he was certainly prepared to sacrifice Poland, and he writes it in order to get Alexander back on track.
Yeah, it's an odd motivational technique to insult them to perform better. Yeah, and of course Poniatowski then showed extraordinary degree of loyalty, because after the Russian debark, he retreated, and actually the Polish corps suffered terrific casualties, but it was the only corps that brought out all its artillery, except for 12 guns, which it had to lend to the old guard, to the French artillery. Yeah, I've read that.
By the French old guard artillery.
I've read that. And they knew how to shod their horses for the ice and snow, or the rest of the army didn't, and things like that. And
so when the French retreated and they all started streaming back to Germany, he tried to hold Poniatowski, and with the remnants of the Polish army, tried to hold the Grand Duchy, and then was forced to fall back with the rest of his corps. And Czar Alexander said to him, "Look, join me, and I'll make a kingdom of Poland, and you can have the army and all that."
Right.
And a lot of Poles were saying, yes, do that, this is the best thing. And he said no, and he negotiated with the Austrians to let him through, to march through and join Napoleon.
Yeah.
And of course, he paid the price, because he then fell at the Battle of Leipzig.
Yeah. Yeah. In 1813, during the German campaigns, the Polish army is again fighting under Napoleon's banner. And I think by day 3, Napoleon realizes he has to retreat. So he has Poniatowski, Oudinot, and I think Marshal MacDonald hold the rear guard. What happened to Poniatowski?
Well, it's an extraordinary moment, because he says to the Poles, he had these moments when he did feel guilty, and this must have been one of them, because he said, look, I can't make you fight for me anymore. If you want to go home, I release you from any obligations. And some did, but most of them clung to him. They believed in him. They didn't trust. Also, they weren't quite sure what would happen to them if they did go home,
Right.
which would have been a consideration. And there is something like esprit de corps, and they were proud to be in that army. One has to remember, people of all nationalities, young men particularly, were enthralled to Napoleon. There was something terribly sexy about serving and fighting under him.
Sure.
And so most of them stuck to him, and stuck to him through thick and thin, through the fighting of 1814. And then one detachment went to Elba with him. And although in 1814, when peace was made, Alexander offered amnesty, and the Polish army then marched back to become the army of the new Kingdom of Poland, there were quite a lot of Poles left behind in depots and hospitals as prisoners of war in various places in France. And so when the 100 Days started, hundreds of them did rally to Napoleon, and indeed fought at Waterloo.
Right.
Which then meant that it was the sort of beginning of a tremendous cult of Napoleon in this country, in Poland, for a number of psychological reasons. For a start, it was the first time between 1807, or actually even from 1797 and 1815, it was the first time since the 17th century that Polish soldiers, the Polish could fight under their own banners and achieve military glory and make a name for themselves and their country. And so that was a fantastically important psychological element. And in every Polish home, there would be engravings of Polish lancers of Napoleon, of that whole epos, which was regarded as a heroic. The other thing about Napoleon was that the Poles felt that they'd been hard done by, because there they were, brave and true, and they had been defeated in the 18th century by 3 nasty, scheming, calculating nations.
Right.
And, well, what do you know? The greatest man of the age, Napoleon, great genius, he had been ultimately defeated by the nation of shopkeepers and the contemptible Russians, Prussians, and Austrians. and yet his glory lived on. So it was a kind of inspiration. And the cult of Napoleon was really, well, it lived on everywhere in various countries, but very, very strongly in Poland for those two reasons.
I was going to ask you about that, the legacy.
And then it was used also politically in the 19th century when the Poles again had to go into exile after the 1830-31 rebellion. The Polish political class that went into exile tried to cultivate, to use the Western constitutional monarchies, Britain and France, to intercede for the Polish cause, because that's the only hope they had. And Britain wasn't really interested in the Poles, or Poland, or Central Europe anyway. But the French were more likely to become allies. And so all the Polish emigres made a huge propaganda thing about how the Poles had always loved the French, and they went on and on about the brotherhood of arms in order to make the French feel that they must support the Poles. But of course, the end product of this was that the Poles themselves developed this conviction that's got under the skin of France under Napoleon was Poland's great friend, which is as far from the truth as you could possibly go.
Well, you mentioned before that he's mentioned in the national anthem in that poem, so there must be some favorable feelings towards Napoleon.
No, I mean, well, the national anthem remains the national anthem, and they haven't changed the wording. Not because the Polish nation are in love with Napoleon still, but because it's historic, and it's a good, there are good national anthems and bad national anthems, and some are good to sing and some are not good to sing, and God Save the King is a very good one.
Sure.
The Marseillaise is a magnificent one.
Great.
But an awful lot of them are pretty third rate. Whereas the Polish national anthem is very good to sing, and the lyrics are good. I mean, they're moving.
Yeah.
And so that's survived. But there are a lot of people for whom Napoleon is still not just an object of fascination, but somewhere they feel a kind of kinship. But I think above all, because when they think of Napoleon, they think of the Polish lancers, of the famous charge at Somosierra, of the swagger and the dash of the whole thing, and of Poniatowski, and indeed, so several other officers and generals, and so it's by association that it has very nice connotations, and it's picturesque. You see, I come back to the fact that I've got in my study next door. I mean, there's some study for work, but in my sort of office next door, I've got 4 huge Vernet prints. One of supposedly at Somosierra, the other one of Joseph Poniatowski leaping into the River Elster at Leipzig, and 2 of Polish lancers in cantonment and on picket duty. which I've known since childhood, and
yeah, there's something romantic and stirring and exciting about it, and I think that's why it stays in your memory and stays in Poland's memory. And I think it's really, really unique to Poland. And you mentioned all the great things, Somysera, their efforts in Germany and Russia and at Leipzig. I think it's all wonderful, and that's why I'm glad you talked to us about it today.
yeah.
Well, thank you again, Adam. For those of you looking for Adam's books, again, they're on Amazon. I recommend Moscow 1812. That's my favorite, but there's many other books that Adam's put together on the Napoleonic period and on Poland. So I recommend those.
I've just produced one which is rather different. It's about a great grandmother of mine who lived through the Napoleonic times, and it's very illustrative of what happened to that part of Europe and to Poland, but not only Poland. But I'm now working on a book about the Napoleon's Peninsular War, which is I think needs serious reevaluation.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to read both of those. That sounds great, Adam. But again, yeah, Adam is always a gentleman, and we're always thrilled to have him on the show. So thank you very much, sir.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Bye.